visitors a minute ago. They left, and then I was thinking, you know what it was? I start projecting, right? So it was the Buddha sitting over there on top of the organ. That scared them off. And then I realized, so they saw the Buddha, then they started looking at the table here. I don't know if they could see the faker who was doing penance with the rock on his chest, or the tiki mask, or the shaman here. But I'm sure that this is what really scared them away. It looks like Cthulhu. You know what I'm talking about from H.P. Lovecraft? Look it up. Google it. So I tried to, I don't know. Maybe they'll come back. So the text I sent out said sign. That's the Greek term for missing the mark in archery. And it's actually this root word for the word sin. So originally, this is what it meant. It meant missing the mark. We've gone crazy with it, as we have with a lot of other things. We've gone crazy with the word and the idea. Originally, it was just thought of as the idea that you did something that didn't measure up to what your best hopes and wishes were. But we've really gone down the road with it. I was thinking about the fact that it comes from that Greek word, and you try to, if you don't do the study, or nobody tells you, it's hard to realize how did we come up with the scriptures that we have today, especially the New Testament, really kind of a mystery when you look at it, and it's originally written mostly in Greek, but it's attributed to the apostles, who none of them were Greek, and they spoke Aramaic, and they were peasants. The people who actually wrote the scriptures in Greek were educated people. And they took the Aramaic sayings and they wrote them in Greek. And then there's designations in those books, the names of certain apostles, but really the writings are anonymous. So what happened here is, years after this resurrection event, either some Greek converts or some scholars who were hired to do the work set down these words in Greek, because that was really the civilized standard of the time. And so what we think of as these, what we have been taught to think of as these stories, which were very passionately set down based on the experience that the apostles had with Jesus, really they were just stories that were told and then written down by these scholarly Greeks. Now, each book was set down for a specific group of people. This other thing that's kind of important, that the Gospels that are named for apostles were written for the church, the group of worshipers that were kind of centered around that apostle, or had been. So they were never actually written to be combined together in one book. So you think about that. So the meditation we're talking about, God's will, it's kind of like a given in the mainstream church that the Bible was written like as like one seamless piece and direct dictation from God, meant to be combined into one thing. Or that's the feel of it, but it's just not the case. The books were gathered together, And then with the other problem, of course, that comes in is that then scribes and translators took over after that, and so we get there's a bunch of different versions of the Bible out there, and there are more differences. Now some of the differences are minute, but there are more differences than there actually are similarities. That's really weird when you think about it. I mean, just words changed here and there, but then there's some things that are very much changed. So this idea of sin has been, I think, mostly, the Old Testament has a number of references to it, but there's this one idea that is prevalent in the Old Testament that kind of changes when we get into the New Testament. And the old idea was that the only real issue was that first commandment, and everything else was like to grow out of it. And the first commandment was love the Lord thy God, right? Have one God, have one, and that was an overarching statement that wasn't just talking about the way we might think about it today as God being like a being that we give worship to, but the idea was that you put nothing else before you in your priority list. You put nothing else before God, because if you did, that turned it into an idol. And this is really how we think about it today. Here is that if our focus moves from God, good, the total of creation, to some small thing that we think we just have to have, that becomes our idol. So in the Hebrew Bible, it turns out they write a whole bunch of other laws. They write a bunch of other rules. And you could say then that violating any of those 500 and some rules was a sin. But every one of them, and as Jesus points out, he says, every one of them relies on the first two commandments. Love God, love thy neighbor as thyself. That everything else grows out of it. And now this is important because when we look at all these other rules, if we can't see how it relates to love, if we can't apply it in the extension of love, then we are not reading it correctly. If we're going to believe Jesus. So if we're looking at it as if we're reading it in a way that is about suffering, then it's either we're misinterpreting or it's been misinterpreted somewhere in the past to present it to us that way. So when Jesus said about this, he says, I didn't come to change the law. He says, I came to fulfill the law. So sin are these mistakes. And then there's this whole big thing about what original sin, the first problem. This is Genesis, and of course Genesis comes at a time before Moses gets the law, the Ten Commandments. Before Moses gets the Ten Commandments up on the mountain, Genesis happens, Garden of Eden, the whole Adam and Eve serpent and the apple incident. That this is identified as original sin. And that original sin is, of course, the eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so we identify this, the original sin. Many people look at this and they analyze the situation and they say original sin is somehow the woman conspiring with the serpent to trick the man, and that the original sin was just disobeying God for the first time. That's the deal. But that's not the instruction that was given to them. Was do not involve yourself with knowledge of good and evil, because there will be a consequence. Because before that, they didn't think about it that way. They were in harmony. They were in harmony. And remember that Adam is symbolic, and he represents all men, and Eve represents all women. And it's also a myth, a group of symbols meant to explain something that happened in the past that they couldn't explain. So, but it seems, it feels right, and it's that somewhere along the line, when we fell out of harmony with creation and started thinking that we were in conflict. And so this is how the Course in Miracles describes this original sin, was the day we decided that we could be separate from God. The Course describes it as a tiny mad idea crept in. And the day we decided we could be separate from God, that's where this all came. And once we did that, then all things that occurred in our life could be suspect, because we're seeing things now as good and bad. And so depending on our perspective, we could identify and interpret any event or any person or any other living thing in those terms. They're a danger to us, they're not a danger to us. Well, the problem with this is that those perceptions change based on what seems to be happening in front of us. So something that we thought was good today, tomorrow we'll say, oh, that was horrible that happened, because other events occurred, right? So the person that we really trusted seems to have betrayed us, so now they're a danger to us. So these shifting perceptions. So what the Course says about sin, it says this very cool thing at the beginning. It says sin is insanity. That's how it starts. So, and when we go to the root words, we think about what we've talked about many times, is this word insanity means broken, fragmented. Like it's the term is meant to describe mainly a state of mind in which we are fragmented, where we're broken and the pieces aren't together. We're like scattered, which is precisely the idea behind separation. So the whole mirror got dropped on the ground and is broken into all kinds of fragments, and so then when you look at it, it's distorted. It's not the same as when the mirror was whole. So sin is insanity. Sin is fragmentation of the mind. So when the mind is fragmented, then everything that the mind observes is fragmented. So when the mind is in this insane state, it looks out at the world and sees everything else as a reflection of that state. Now here's the very interesting part of it. The more insane, the more fragmented we are on the inside, the worse we see on the outside. So to put it another way, we take our own little tiny fragment of God apart from the whole, and the farther we take it away into ourselves, in other words, the more self-centered we are, the more fragmented we see the world when we look out. Till we can get to the point where we don't even see anything, but we are just like totally almost catatonic in that self-centeredness. So it's a way of describing mental illness. So here, this is another way to say this too. Sin is mental illness. Seeing it, thinking we're doing it, mental illness. It is the means by which the mind is driven mad and seeks to let illusions take the place of truth. So the illusion that's to take the place of truth is that the mirror never got broken. The truth is that it's one thing, it's always been one thing, it always will be one thing, but our dysfunction tells us that it's broken. And so what we started to talk about earlier was this thing about change. So it seems like change is like going on all over the place. Change is continually is happening. And that is the condition of the world. The condition of the world is the only thing that is constant in the world is change. Everything in the world is changing. But there's this really important piece that can keep us anchored into reality, is that God does not change. Spirit does not change. That's constant, eternal, always the same. And the sameness of God. Now you would think right away when we consider the idea, it sounds like that would be very boring. Just like this changeless state. But we don't really, in our present state of mind, we don't really understand or comprehend what this changeless state of continual bliss and joy really is. We get little tastes of it, just little teasers from time to time, but we don't really know. And so what the ego tells us, what the separation tells us is, well, that would be a horrible state of affairs, because it's just like, it's like flat. There's like nothing, there's nothing to it. But it's not flat down here, it's flat up here. And when I say up here, I mean higher than we can think about. So what this focus on sin does is it puts our attention on what's broken and not on, well, what it says here is real. And what's broken is not real. It's illusory. So being mad, it sees illusions where the truth should be and where it really is. So because of this state of mind, of fragmentation, we see the bad. And we look at change when it occurs. If we really don't have a good handle on, if we don't think that we're like in some kind of control over the change that's occurring, we see it as very dangerous, and it at the least it causes a state of unease in us. But if we can keep going back to this sense, and it has to be a feeling. It has to be, well, some would call it faith. The faith, the understanding that God stands under all, despite the appearance of dangerous change that is going on. That there is this constant thing. The love of God is present. And if I can put my attention on that, what will happen is it will translate into the outer. So let me just put it this way. Here's what we know, that what's going on the inside is reflected on the outside. So if I am focused on and concentrating on what looks like some dangerous, just say unpleasant thing, or things could happen, not quite sure what they are, but I know they're bad, and I can extrapolate on it. I mean, I can go down the road with any one of the scenarios and paint these horrible pictures. If this is what I focus on, now what Job found out is that some of those things come true, right? My fears have come upon me. But they don't necessarily even have to come true, because in that experience of worrying about them and fretting about them and allowing ourselves to give that attention to it, it already causes all kinds of suffering. It doesn't even have to come true. But what I think is that the more we focus on those type of things, the more those type of things come true. And then, of course, that gives us evidence. Then we have the evidence to say, see, I was right. The world is really a kind of a nasty place, and all these bad things are happening. But if I have discipline, and I turn my attention back to this idea of wholeness, of oneness, and and actually think about it, focus on it, feel it, then the way I see the world changes. Over time, we can heal on the inside, and then when that happens, and we'll get evidence of it. Because see, if we focus on the good, if we focus on that, we will start to find evidence for that in our experience and in the world. Still, fears come back, and they want to always point out why we should be afraid. So think about the body and the experiences that the body has. The body is an instrument of the mind. It's a theory. Just consider that it might be true, that the body is an instrument of the mind, rather than the mind is like some kind of accessory to the body. You think about it the other way, right? So it is an instrument of the mind, and what's going on when we're in suffering is that it is making all these efforts to deceive itself. That the body itself, it was made and designed to strive with the world. And this is exactly what God says to Adam after the incident. He says, you will strive. You will find yourself in struggles with the earth, and it will not give up its fruits to you. Not because God is mad, but because you ate of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. So now you're in this struggle, you're in this conflict, and because of that, nothing is in harmony with you. So you're going to have trouble. You're going to have trouble feeding yourself. Because you think you are in conflict with the world. So, yet the goal of striving can change. So because the body is an instrument of the mind, we can change its goal. We can change its goal instead of striving against. In other words, instead of getting in the mix of conflict, that depending on what we focus on, if we focus on the wholeness of things,